The last time I saw my grandmother alive, she grabbed my wrist with more strength than I thought her frail body could manage. Her fingers were cold and thin, almost like paper wrapped around bone, but her grip was iron. She pulled me close to her face, so close I could smell the faint lavender of her perfume mixed with the antiseptic smell of the hospice, and she whispered something that I dismissed entirely. She said, "Don't trust him, Emily. Don't ever trust him. He's not what you think he is. Promise me you'll remember that." I smiled at her the way you smile at someone you love but don't quite believe. I patted her hand gently and told her to rest, told her everything was going to be fine, told her that Grandad Harry was taking care of everything and there was nothing to worry about. The look in her eyes when I said his name will haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something worse. It was resignation. It was the look of someone who had been screaming into a void for decades and had finally accepted that no one would ever hear her. She died 3 days later. I held her hand when she went, and I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing by having Grandad Harry on her other side. I thought I was giving her peace. I thought I was giving her the comfort of her family united around her in her final moments. I was so unbelievably wrong. I grew up worshiping Harold Whitmore. Everyone did. In our family, he wasn't just a grandfather. He was a living legend, a man who had built himself from nothing into something remarkable. The stories of his life were told at every family gathering like sacred texts passed down through generations. He came from poverty, genuine grinding poverty in post-war England. The kind where you shared shoes with your siblings and meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. By the time I knew him, he was a retired senior banker who lived in a beautiful Victorian house in Hampstead, drove a vintage Jaguar he polished every Sunday, and had a wine collection that made visitors gasp with admiration. His transformation from that hungry little boy in a cramped, terraced house to the distinguished gentleman who summered in the south of France was the stuff of fairy tales. He was proof that hard work, intelligence, and determination could elevate anyone. That's what I believed. That's what everyone believed. He made sure of it. My grandmother, in contrast, was always painted as difficult. That was the word everyone used. Difficult. My mother would say it with a sigh and a shake of her head whenever Gran did something that didn't fit the family narrative. If she was quiet at a dinner party, she was being difficult. If she asked too many questions about money, she was being difficult. If she retreated to her art studio in the garden for hours at a time, she was being difficult and antisocial. I absorbed these judgments the way children absorb everything, without question or examination. I learned to see my grandmother through the lens my family provided, and that lens was smudged with frustration and dismissal. I loved her, of course I did, but I loved her the way you love someone you've been taught to pity rather than respect. I saw her as fragile, perhaps a bit paranoid. Certainly not someone whose opinions about her husband of 56 years should be taken seriously. The warning started when I was about 14 years old. Gran pulled me aside at a Christmas gathering, leading me into the kitchen under the pretense of helping her with the dishes, and she told me that Grandad wasn't always kind. She said it so quietly, almost under her breath, that I had to lean in to hear her over the sound of running water and clinking glasses from the other room. She said that he had a temper, that he could be cruel when no one was watching, that the man everyone saw at parties was a performance he had perfected over decades. I remember feeling uncomfortable and confused. I asked her what she meant, and she seemed to lose her nerve, shaking her head and returning to the dishes with trembling hands. She told me to forget she said anything. But then, almost as an afterthought, she added that I should never depend on him for anything, never let him have control over my finances or my future. I didn't understand. I was 14. My grandfather had just bought me an expensive camera for Christmas because I'd mentioned an interest in photography, and he had promised to take me to Paris to photograph the architecture the following summer. He was the most generous person I knew. I decided my grandmother was confused, maybe even a little jealous of the attention he showed me. I told my mother about the conversation later that night. I thought I was doing the right thing, expressing concern about Gran's mental state, maybe suggesting she needed to see a doctor. My mother's reaction was immediate and sharp. She told me never to repeat what Gran had said to anyone, especially not to Granddad, because it would hurt him terribly. She said Gran had always been this way, prone to dark moods and irrational suspicions, and that it was best to just smile and nod when she got like this. The message was clear. Gran's words meant nothing. Granddad was the center of our family, the source of our stability and status, and questioning him was not something we did. I internalized that lesson completely. For the next 18 years, whenever my grandmother tried to warn me, I dismissed her with the same patient condescension my mother had taught me. But Gran never stopped trying, even when I stopped listening. She would slip comments into conversations when no one else was around. She would leave me small notes hidden in birthday cards with cryptic messages about being careful. Once, when I was in my early 20s and had just started my accounting career, she called me and asked if I had a safe deposit box, somewhere completely separate from any family assets, somewhere Granddad didn't know about. I laughed and asked her why I would need something like that. She paused for a long moment on the phone, and then she said something I only understood years later. She said, "Because there may come a day when you need to prove what he's taken from you." I told her she was being dramatic. I changed the subject to something lighter. I got off the phone as quickly as I could because her intensity made me uncomfortable. She was disrupting the carefully maintained image I had of my family, and I resented her for it. God, I resented her for trying to save me. The first cracks in my perception of Granddad Harry appeared about 3 years before Gran died. I was going through my own personal crisis at the time. My marriage to Daniel was falling apart, and I wasn't paying close attention to the subtle signs that something was wrong in the Whitmore household. But looking back, I can see them clearly now. Gran started looking more tired than usual, thinner, grayer, as if something was slowly draining the life out of her. She stopped painting, which was significant because her art had been her sanctuary for as long as I could remember. Her garden studio, once filled with vibrant canvases and the smell of oil paints, grew dusty and abandoned. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said she didn't have the energy anymore. I assumed it was age. I assumed it was natural decline. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. Around the same time, Granddad Harry started being even more generous than usual, particularly with me. He paid off the remainder of my university loans without me asking. He offered to help with the legal fees for my divorce. He started talking about his will constantly, assuring me that I was going to be well taken care of, that he had plans for my future that would set me up for life. I was grateful. Overwhelmed with gratitude, actually, because Daniel had left me financially devastated and emotionally shattered. Granddad became my rock during that period. He was the one who told me I was better off without Daniel, that I deserved someone who would appreciate me, that I was a Whitmore and Whitmores didn't beg for scraps of affection from unworthy men. His words built me back up when I felt broken. His financial support gave me stability when everything else was chaos. I loved him more than ever during that time. I defended him against Gran's subtle criticisms more fiercely than ever. I was his champion, his devoted granddaughter, completely blind to the puppet strings he was using to control me. Gran died on a cold February morning. The hospice called at 6 in the morning, and I drove through the dark streets of London, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. Despite our complicated relationship, despite my frustration with her darkness and her warnings, I had never imagined a world without her in it. She was a constant. Even if she was a constant, I didn't fully appreciate. By the time I arrived, she had already slipped into unconsciousness, but the nurses said she might still be able to hear us. I sat with her and talked about nothing important, about the weather, about a show I was watching, about anything that would fill the terrible silence of that room. Granddad arrived an hour later, impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair perfectly combed, his face arranged in an expression of dignified grief. He sat on the other side of her bed and held her hand, and I remember thinking how beautiful it was, this elderly couple saying goodbye after more than half a century together. The nurses commented on it, how devoted he was, how lucky she was to have such a loving husband with her at the end. he accepted their compliments with humble grace. When Gran took her final breath, he bowed his head and wept. The funeral was a week later, a grand affair befitting the wife of Harold Whitmore. The church was packed with people I barely recognized, colleagues from his banking days, neighbors, distant relatives, all there to pay their respects. The eulogy Granddad gave was stunning, a masterpiece of emotion and elegance that had people openly sobbing in the pews. He spoke about Gran's beauty, her grace, her dedication to their family. He spoke about their love story, how he had known she was the one the moment he saw her at a dance hall in 1968, how she had supported him through every triumph and every challenge, how his success was really her success because she had been the foundation upon which everything was built. I sat in the front row crying, feeling like I hadn't appreciated her enough while she was alive, feeling guilty for all the times I had dismissed her concerns as the ramblings of a difficult woman. Granddad caught my eye during the eulogy and gave me a small, sad smile, and I felt bound to him by our shared grief. We were united in loss. I had no idea that everything he said at that funeral was a calculated lie. The first real clue came about a month after the funeral. Granddad asked me to help him go through Gran's belongings, to decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. I agreed immediately, partly because I wanted to be helpful and partly because I was looking for an excuse to stay close to him. I was worried about him being alone in that big house, worried about how he was coping with the loss. He seemed to be handling it remarkably well, actually, which I attributed to his incredible strength of character. He told me to start with her studio, to pack up the art supplies and decide which paintings were worth keeping. He said it casually, almost dismissively, as if the studio and everything in it was unimportant. That should have been my first warning sign. Gran had spent thousands of hours in that studio over the decades. Her art was her identity, her escape, her soul rendered in oil and canvas. The fact that Granddad showed so little interest in preserving it should have told me something. I spent a Saturday afternoon in the studio, surrounded by dust and the lingering ghost of turpentine. Most of the paintings were landscapes, beautiful and melancholic, scenes of places I didn't recognize, but that must have meant something to her. A few were portraits, mostly of me and my mother when we were younger, and one haunting self-portrait where she looked directly at the viewer with eyes that seemed to be pleading for something. I packed the paintings carefully, planning to keep them all even if Granddad thought they were worthless. But it was when I started clearing out the drawers of her old wooden desk that everything changed. Hidden beneath years of accumulated sketches and receipts for art supplies, I found a locked metal box. The lock was small and rusted, easy enough to break with a screwdriver I found among her tools. Inside, there were journals, 7 of them, spanning from 1975 to 2019, each one filled with Gran's neat, slanted handwriting. There were also documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to me, sealed in an envelope that had yellowed with age. I sat down on the dusty floor of that studio and opened the letter first. My hands were shaking, though I didn't fully understand why yet. The letter was dated 3 years earlier, and it began with an apology. Gran wrote that she was sorry for what I was about to learn. Sorry that she had never been brave enough to tell me directly, sorry that I was going to have to discover the truth alone when she was no longer there to explain or comfort. She wrote that she had tried to warn me my entire life, but she knew I hadn't believed her, and she didn't blame me for that. She wrote that Granddad was a master of manipulation, that he had spent their entire marriage controlling everything she did, isolating her from friends and family, taking credit for her sacrifices, and systematically destroying anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. She wrote that the journals would explain everything, and she begged me to read them with an open mind, to give her the trust in death that she had never received in life. She signed it with love and the simple words, "I tried, Emily. I really tried." I don't know how long I sat there staring at that letter. The words didn't make sense to me at first. They couldn't be true. My grandfather was wonderful. Everyone said so. The entire family was built on the foundation of his wonderfulness. But Gran's words were so clear, so earnest, so desperate even in their written form, that I couldn't simply dismiss them the way I always had before. She wasn't there to be interrupted or contradicted or soothed into silence. She could only speak through these pages, and for the first time in my life, I decided to actually listen. I took the journals and the box home with me that night, hiding them in my car before going back into the house to say goodbye to Granddad. He asked me if I had found anything interesting in the studio, and something in his tone made me hesitate. There was a sharpness beneath his casual question, a hint of concern that he quickly masked with a smile. I told him I had only found old art supplies and some sketches. Nothing important. He seemed relieved, though he hid it well. He patted my shoulder and told me I was a good granddaughter, the best he could have hoped for, and that Gran would be proud of how I was handling everything. I smiled and nodded and got out of there as quickly as I could. The box felt like it was burning a hole in the boot of my car. I knew, even before I read a single journal entry, that my life was about to change irrevocably. I started reading that night, beginning with the earliest journal dated 1975, 7 years into their marriage. The first entry was mundane, a description of a dinner party they had attended. But even in those ordinary words, something felt off. Gran wrote about being careful not to embarrass Harry, about making sure she said the right things to the right people, about the argument they'd had in the car on the way home, when she had apparently made a comment that reflected poorly on his professional judgment. The argument, as she described it, was vicious. Harry had called her stupid, had told her she was lucky he tolerated her, had threatened to cancel a visit to her sister that she had been looking forward to for months. She wrote about lying awake that night, listening to him sleep peacefully beside her, wondering how she had ended up in a marriage where she felt like a prisoner. I read for hours that first night, moving through the journals chronologically, watching the relationship deteriorate year after year. The psychological abuse was constant and insidious. Harry controlled every aspect of Gran's life. He managed all of their money and gave her a weekly allowance that she had to account for down to the penny. He decided which friends she could see and systematically drove away anyone who tried to get too close to her. He criticized her constantly, her appearance, her intelligence, her cooking, her housekeeping, until she believed she was worthless and lucky to have him. He took credit for her ideas, her work, her contributions to his career, and then turned around and told everyone how much he had sacrificed to support his difficult wife. The manipulation was so sophisticated, so complete, that Gran spent years believing she was the problem, believing that his cruelty was her fault, believing that if she could just be better, just be enough, he would love her the way he pretended to love her in public. But the journals revealed even darker secrets than psychological abuse. In 1983, Gran discovered that Harry had been having an affair with his secretary for years. When she confronted him, he didn't deny it. He told her calmly that he would continue doing whatever he wanted, and if she ever told anyone or tried to leave him, he would destroy her. He would tell everyone she was mentally unstable. He would take the house, the money, the children, everything. He reminded her that she had no career, no savings of her own, no way to survive without him. He reminded her that her own parents had passed away and her sister barely spoke to her anymore, thanks to his careful work isolating her from her family. She was trapped, and he knew it. She wrote about sitting in the bathroom that night, holding a bottle of sleeping pills, wondering if it would be easier to just end everything. She didn't take them, but she came close. She came terrifyingly close. The financial abuse was documented in meticulous detail in the later journals. Gran had inherited money from her parents when they died in the late 80s, a significant sum that should have given her security and independence. Harry convinced her to put it all in a joint account, promising that it would be used for their retirement, for their grandchildren's futures, for their legacy together. Instead, he slowly siphoned it away, investing it in ventures that failed, lending it to friends who never paid it back, spending it on luxuries and mistresses while Gran never saw a penny of her own inheritance. She confronted him about it in 1995 and recorded his response in her journal with obvious devastation. He told her that her parents' money had been worthless anyway, a pittance compared to what he earned, and that she should be grateful he had managed it at all instead of letting her fritter it away on her pointless paintings. He told her that everything they had was because of him, and without him, she would be nothing. She believed him. She believed him because he had spent decades making her believe she was worthless. The most disturbing entries came from the 2000s and 2010s, when Gran started documenting not just the abuse against her, but patterns she was observing in how Harry treated others. She wrote about my mother, about how Harry had systematically undermined Susan's confidence since childhood, always criticizing, always comparing her unfavorably to her brother Richard, always making her feel like she had to earn his love and never quite succeeded. She wrote about how Susan had married my father partly to escape the house, only to find herself repeating patterns of seeking approval from emotionally unavailable men. She wrote about Richard, the golden child, who Harry had molded into a smaller version of himself, ambitious and ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to stay in their father's good graces. She wrote about watching Richard slowly become someone she didn't recognize, someone who would lie and manipulate and even steal to prove himself worthy of being Harry Whitmore's son. And she wrote about me. Page after page about me, about how much she loved me, about how terrified she was that Harry was doing to me what he had done to everyone else. She documented every gift he gave me, every promise he made, every moment of excessive generosity that was designed to bind me to him. She saw what I couldn't see, that his love came with strings attached, that his support was an investment he expected returns on, that his kindness was a tool of control rather than an expression of genuine affection. She wrote about trying to warn me, about my reactions, about the way I defended him, and looked at her with pity and frustration. She wrote about the heartbreak of watching her granddaughter fall into the same trap she had been caught in for half a century. She wrote about praying I would understand before it was too late, while simultaneously believing I probably never would. The journals also contained something I hadn't expected: evidence. Gran had spent years quietly gathering documentation of Harry's financial misdeeds, not just against her, but against others. There were copies of bank statements showing money moved into accounts that shouldn't have existed. There were records of properties purchased in his name with money that appeared to come from questionable sources. There were notes about conversations she had overheard, references to people who had been cheated or threatened into silence. My grandmother, dismissed by everyone as fragile and paranoid, had been conducting a one-woman investigation into her husband's activities for decades. She hadn't done anything with the information because she was afraid of him, afraid of not being believed, afraid of what he would do to her if he discovered what she knew. But she had gathered it carefully, preserved it meticulously, and left it for someone who might finally be brave enough to use it. I finished reading the journals at 4 a.m, sitting in my apartment with the documents spread across my floor, crying so hard I could barely breathe. The world I knew had been a lie. The man I adored was a monster. The woman I had dismissed and pitied was a victim who had spent her entire life trying to protect me from the truth. And I had failed her. I had failed her completely, utterly, unforgivably. I had stood at her bedside while she died and let her killer hold her other hand. Because that's what Harry was, I realized. He hadn't put a knife in her or poison in her tea, but he had killed her slowly over 56 years, killed her spirit and her confidence and her health and her hope, killed everything that made her who she could have been. And I had helped him. I had been his unwitting accomplice, dismissing her warnings, defending his reputation, giving him the adoring granddaughter audience his ego required. I was complicit in her destruction, and I would have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life. But guilt wasn't enough. Grief wasn't enough. My grandmother deserved more than my tears and my belated understanding. She deserved justice. She deserved to have her truth known, to have her warnings vindicated, to have the monster she married face consequences for what he had done to her. And so, in that early morning darkness, surrounded by the evidence of decades of cruelty, I made a decision. I was going to destroy Harold Whitmore. I was going to expose him for what he really was. I was going to make sure the world saw the truth that my grandmother had tried so desperately to tell. I was going to get revenge, not through violence or illegal means, but through the careful, methodical exposure of every lie he had ever told. I was going to be the instrument of his downfall. I was going to finish what Gran had started. The first thing I did was make copies of everything. I photographed every page of every journal. I scanned every document. I stored duplicates in multiple locations. A safe deposit box at a bank Harry had no connection to. A secure cloud storage account. A USB drive I kept in my office at work. Gran had warned me about being careful, about making sure Harry couldn't make evidence disappear, and I took her advice seriously, even though I was years too late. Once everything was secure, I sat down and started to truly analyze what she had gathered. The financial documents were particularly interesting to me because of my professional background. Numbers made sense to me in a way that emotional manipulation didn't, and the numbers Gran had recorded told a damning story. The most significant discovery was related to Gran's inheritance, but the trail led much further than I had initially realized. When Gran's parents died, they left behind not just cash and investments, but also property, specifically a building in Manchester that had been in her family for generations. According to the documents Gran had saved, Harry had convinced her to transfer the property into his name shortly after her parents' death, promising that it would simplify the estate management. She had trusted him, signed the papers without reading them carefully, and never thought about it again. But Gran had later obtained copies of subsequent transactions, and what I found was staggering. Harry hadn't just taken control of the property. He had sold it in 2005 for nearly £2 million, money that Gran never saw a penny of and had never been informed about. The sale documents listed Harry as the sole owner with no mention of Margaret Whitmore whatsoever. He had essentially stolen a family inheritance from his own wife and erased any evidence that it had ever been hers. But that was just the beginning. As I dug deeper into the documents, cross-referencing bank statements and property records, I started to see a pattern of financial manipulation that extended beyond Gran. Harry had done the same thing to his sister, who had died in 2010 and whose small estate had somehow ended up entirely in his control, despite there being other surviving relatives. He had done something similar to a business partner in the 1990s, a man whose name appeared in Gran's journals as someone who had confronted Harry about missing funds and then mysteriously suffered a series of personal and professional disasters that left him bankrupt and broken. There were hints of tax irregularities, shell companies, and hidden accounts that suggested Harry's wealth wasn't built on hard work and determination alone. Some of it was built on theft, manipulation, and the exploitation of people who trusted him. I knew I couldn't expose all of this on my own. The financial crimes were complex, and I needed to verify that my grandmother's evidence was accurate before making any accusations. More importantly, I needed to understand the current state of Harry's finances, not just what he had done decades ago, but what he was doing now. I was going to need help, and I was going to need to be extremely careful about who I trusted. Harry had spent his entire life cultivating relationships with powerful people. He had friends in banking, in law, in local government. If I made a wrong move, if I trusted the wrong person, the information could get back to him and everything would be lost. He would destroy the evidence, discredit me the way he had discredited Gran, and walk away unscathed. I decided to start with someone I knew I could trust, or at least someone who had reason to distrust Harry as much as I was beginning to. My mother's brother Richard was out of the question. He was too deeply under Harry's influence, too invested in eventually inheriting his father's wealth and status. But there was someone else in my family's history who might be willing to help. Gran's sister, my great-aunt Dorothy, was still alive at 81, living in a care home in Leeds. Gran's journals mentioned that Harry had worked hard to destroy her relationship with Dorothy. and that the sisters had been mostly estranged for the last 30 years of Gran's life. Dorothy might know things that Gran hadn't written down, and if Harry had isolated Gran from her, Dorothy might be more than willing to help me bring him down. I made the drive to Leeds on a gray Saturday morning, my car filled with the nervous energy of someone about to open a door that could never be closed again. I hadn't seen Dorothy since I was a teenager, and I had vague memories of a woman who seemed sad and distant at family gatherings, who left early and never quite fit in. Now I understood why. Harry had made sure she didn't fit in. He had poisoned everyone against her, including me. The care home was pleasant and clean, with cheerful staff and comfortable common areas, but there was an inevitable sadness to it, all those lives narrowing to small rooms and scheduled meals. I found Dorothy in a sunroom, sitting by a window with a book in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment, I saw confusion in her eyes, then recognition, then something that looked like hope and fear combined. "Emily," she said, and her voice was stronger than I expected. "You look so much like your grandmother, like she looked when she was young before." She stopped herself, glancing around as if she expected someone to be listening. I sat down beside her and told her everything. I told her about the journals, the evidence, the letter Gran had left me. I told her about my own guilt and my determination to expose Harry for what he really was. I told her I needed help, needed information, needed someone who understood what Gran had endured and why it mattered that the truth come out. Dorothy listened without interrupting, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read, and when I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I tried to help her," she finally said, and her voice was thick with old grief. "When we were younger, when I first started to see what he was, I tried to get her to leave. I offered her money, a place to stay, anything she needed, but she was already too afraid, and he was already too powerful. He told her I was jealous of her life, that I was trying to destroy her marriage because I couldn't find a husband of my own. He told lies about me to the whole family until everyone believed I was the villain and he was the saint protecting his wife from her toxic sister." She shook her head slowly. "He's good at that. Making people believe the opposite of the truth. Making victims look like villains and villains look like victims." Dorothy had information that wasn't in the journals, older stories from before Gran had started writing things down. She remembered things Gran had told her in confidence in the early years of the marriage, before Harry had successfully separated them. She remembered the first time Gran had shown up at her door with bruises she claimed came from a fall. She remembered the time Gran had called her crying in the middle of the night, whispering so Harry wouldn't hear, talking about wanting to die. She remembered every failed attempt to help, every door that closed, every moment of watching her sister disappear into a marriage that was slowly killing her. And she had something else, something I hadn't expected. She had letters, old letters Gran had written to her over the years, letters that Harry didn't know about because Gran had mailed them in secret during the rare moments she could escape his surveillance. The letters were hidden in Dorothy's room at the care home, preserved in a shoebox beneath her bed. Because even now, even in her 80s in a care home far from Harry's reach, she was afraid he would somehow find out and take them. I spent the rest of that day reading the letters with Dorothy, crying together over words that spanned decades, words of love and desperation and hopelessness that Gran had never been able to speak aloud. The letters confirmed and expanded on what the journals revealed. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare, clinging to her connection with her sister as her only lifeline to sanity. And they contained specific details about financial transactions, about properties and accounts, about Harry's business dealings that Dorothy had helped Gran research over the years, even as their in-person contact became impossible. Before I left the care home that evening, Dorothy grabbed my hand with the same desperate strength my grandmother had shown in her final days. "Be careful," she warned me. "Harry knows how to destroy people. He's been doing it his whole life. If he finds out what you're doing before you're ready, he'll turn everyone against you. He'll make you look crazy, just like he made your grandmother look. Promise me you'll be careful." I promised. And I meant it. I wasn't going to underestimate Harold Whitmore. I was going to dismantle him piece by piece, so carefully and completely that by the time he realized what was happening, there would be nothing left for him to fight with. Over the next several months, I conducted the most meticulous investigation of my life. My training as an accountant was invaluable. I knew how to read financial documents, how to trace money through complex transactions, how to identify irregularities that pointed to fraud or theft. I requested copies of public records, property transfers, company registrations, anything that was legally accessible without raising suspicion. I built spreadsheets tracking Harry's assets and income over decades, comparing what he claimed to have earned through legitimate means with what the records actually showed. The discrepancies were significant. Either Harry had access to income sources he had never declared, or money was appearing in his accounts from nowhere. Both possibilities suggested crimes that could be prosecuted, but I was still missing pieces of the puzzle. The really damaging evidence would be in private documents I didn't have access to, bank statements, business correspondence, legal agreements that Harry had kept hidden. I needed to get inside his world without alerting him, which meant I had to keep playing the role of devoted granddaughter while secretly preparing to destroy him. It was the hardest acting job of my life. I visited him regularly, bringing groceries and flowers, listening to his stories about the old days, pretending to hang on his every word while calculating how each anecdote fit into the pattern of deception I was uncovering. I smiled when he patted my hand and called me his favorite. I nodded sympathetically when he complained about how difficult Gran had been, how much he had sacrificed to take care of her. I bit my tongue until it nearly bled, swallowing rage and grief and the overwhelming urge to confront him with everything I knew. The breakthrough came about 8 months after Gran's death. Harry mentioned casually that he was going to be away for a weekend, visiting old friends in the countryside. He asked if I would mind stopping by the house to collect his post and water the plants. I agreed immediately, keeping my voice calm and cheerful, even as my heart raced with the possibilities. This was my chance. I would have access to the house for an entire weekend, time to search for documents that Gran might not have been able to reach, time to photograph evidence that could prove his crimes beyond doubt. That weekend, I became a burglar in my own grandfather's house. I went through every drawer, every cabinet, every closet. I found his study locked, but the key was hidden in the kitchen drawer, where Gran's journals said it would be, right where she had documented finding it 20 years earlier. Inside the study, I discovered the organized records of a man who believed himself untouchable. There were files on investments, property holdings, and business ventures going back decades. There were folders containing documents related to Gran's inheritance, the property sale she had never been told about, and the accounts where the money had been hidden. There were letters from lawyers discussing how to structure assets to minimize inheritance tax in ways that seemed designed to exclude my mother from receiving anything significant. There were records of payments to individuals I didn't recognize, regular monthly payments over years that suggested blackmail or hush money rather than legitimate expenses. And tucked away in a safe behind a painting, the combination to which was helpfully recorded in a coded notebook Gran had left in her studio, I found the most damaging evidence of all. There were documents relating to a fraud scheme from the late 80s, when Harry had been working at a senior level in banking. He had helped facilitate something that looked a lot like embezzlement, moving money through fake accounts, covering tracks, and taking a significant cut for himself. The documents suggested that other people had taken the fall for this scheme, had gone to prison while Harry had walked away clean. There was correspondence with lawyers about managing the fallout, about witnesses who needed to be dealt with, about the importance of ensuring certain records never surfaced. This wasn't just domestic abuse and financial manipulation. This was serious criminal activity that had destroyed lives while Harry prospered. I photographed everything. I was methodical and thorough, making sure every document was captured clearly, making sure nothing was out of place when I finished. I put everything back exactly where I had found it, relocked the study, returned the key to its hiding spot, and left the house looking exactly as it had when I arrived. Harry came home from his weekend with no idea that his entire carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down. But I still wasn't ready to act. I needed to verify the banking documents, to understand exactly what had happened and who else had been involved. I needed to make sure my accusations would hold up under scrutiny, that I had enough evidence to prove my claims without relying solely on my grandmother's journals. I started reaching out to people, very carefully, very quietly. I contacted a journalist who specialized in financial crimes, someone with a reputation for protecting sources and investigating powerful people. I spoke with a lawyer who had experience in cases involving elder abuse and financial exploitation. I even tracked down the man who had gone to prison for the banking fraud, a former colleague of Harry's named Graham Bennett, who was now in his 70s and living in a small flat in Birmingham. Graham Bennett changed everything. When I showed up at his door and explained who I was and why I was there, he looked at me like I was a ghost. He invited me in with trembling hands and spent 3 hours telling me things that made the journals and documents come alive in horrifying detail. Graham had been Harry's deputy at the bank. He had trusted Harry completely, had considered him a mentor and friend. And when the fraud was discovered, Harry had framed him perfectly. Harry had doctored records, manufactured evidence, and testified against Graham in court with tears in his eyes, claiming he had been deceived by a man he thought of as a brother. Graham had spent 4 years in prison. He had lost his marriage, his career, his pension, his reputation. He had spent the decades since trying to rebuild a life from the ashes, while Harry had sailed on to greater success and admiration. I tried to fight back, Graham told me, his voice hollow with old defeat. I tried to tell people what really happened, but no one believed me. Harry was too respectable, too charming, too well-connected. Everyone thought I was just bitter, just looking for someone else to blame. He destroyed me so completely that I couldn't even get people to listen to the truth. The similarities to what Harry had done to Gran were impossible to miss. He used the same playbook over and over, cultivating trust, exploiting vulnerability, taking what he wanted, and then rewriting the narrative to make his victims look like the villains while he played the innocent hero. He had been doing it his entire life, perfecting his technique, never facing consequences because he chose his victims carefully and covered his tracks well. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated my grandmother. He had dismissed her as weak and broken, never realizing that she was documenting everything, building a case against him year after year, preparing for a reckoning that she wouldn't live to see. And now I was going to finish what she started. I spent another month putting everything together, working with the journalist and the lawyer to build a comprehensive case. The journalist, whose name was Rebecca Marsh, was particularly invaluable. She had sources within the banking industry who could verify the fraud documents. She had contacts at regulatory agencies who were interested in reopening questions about old cases if new evidence emerged. She understood how to tell a story that would capture public attention while holding up to legal scrutiny. She was also, crucially, experienced at protecting vulnerable sources from retaliation by powerful targets. She had seen people like Harry before, and she knew how dangerous they could be when cornered. We decided on a coordinated approach. Rebecca would publish an investigative piece about Harry's banking fraud, including interviews with Graham and documentary evidence from the safe. Simultaneously, my lawyer would file a civil suit on behalf of my grandmother's estate, seeking recovery of the inheritance Harry had stolen and damages for decades of financial abuse. I would give a statement to the police regarding the theft and fraud, providing all the evidence I had gathered. And finally, I would speak publicly about my grandmother's experience, using her journals to tell the story of a woman who had been silenced and dismissed for decades, but had never stopped trying to expose the truth. The timing would be coordinated so that Harry would face a cascade of consequences all at once, too many to manage, too public to suppress, too well documented to dismiss. The hardest part was deciding what to do about my family. My mother was still completely under Harry's influence, still defending him against any criticism, still unable to see the truth, even after a lifetime of being made to feel inadequate by him. Uncle Richard was even worse. He had built his entire identity around being Harry's successor, the favored son who would inherit the Whitmore legacy. Exposing Harry meant blowing up my family completely, destroying relationships that couldn't be rebuilt, forcing people to confront truths they had spent their whole lives avoiding. I agonized over this for weeks, losing sleep, questioning whether I had the right to upend everyone's lives for the sake of a dead woman's vindication. In the end, it was Gran's letter that gave me the answer. She had written that she didn't want to hurt anyone, that she wished there was a way to protect the family from the fallout of truth. But she had also written that secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch, that the family's refusal to see Harry clearly had already caused immeasurable damage, that the only way forward was through the pain of honesty. "The truth will hurt," she wrote, "but the lies have been hurting worse for longer. Don't protect them from truth, Emily. Protect them from him." I decided to trust her judgment. She had been right about everything else. She was probably right about this too. I called my mother the day before everything was scheduled to break. I asked her to come to my apartment, told her it was important, told her I needed to show her something before she saw it anywhere else. She came reluctantly, already defensive, already bracing for some kind of confrontation she could sense coming. When she arrived, I sat her down and put Gran's journals in front of her. I told her to read them. I told her I would be there when she had questions, and then I waited. Watching my mother read those journals was one of the most painful experiences of my life. She started with skepticism bordering on hostility, clearly expecting to find exaggerations and distortions that she could easily dismiss. But as she read, her expression changed. The color drained from her face. Her hands started to shake. Tears began falling onto the pages, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. She read for hours while I sat silently across the room, giving her space to process what she was discovering. When she finally looked up, her face was shattered in a way I had never seen before. "I knew," she whispered, and her voice broke on the word. Somewhere, somehow, I knew. I always felt like something was wrong, like the stories didn't quite match reality. But I couldn't let myself see it. He was my father. I needed him to be good. I needed him to be the hero he always said he was. And every time Mum tried to tell me something different, I couldn't hear it. I couldn't let it be true. She looked at me with eyes full of devastation. "I was cruel to her, Emily. I took his side over and over again. I let him make me think she was the problem. How do I live with that? How do I ever forgive myself?" I didn't have an answer for her. I was asking myself the same questions. All I could do was hold her hand and tell her that we couldn't change the past, but we could change what happened next. I told her about the investigation, about what was going to become public, about the choice she had to make between standing with her father and standing with the truth. She cried for a long time, but when the tears stopped, there was something different in her eyes, something that looked like the beginning of strength. "Do what you need to do," she said. "I won't stop you. I won't protect him. Not anymore." Uncle Richard was a different story. I didn't try to warn him in advance because I knew he would go straight to Harry with any information I gave him. Richard had too much invested in the status quo, too much to lose if Harry fell. His property development business was largely funded by Harry's money and connections. His social standing was built on being the son and heir of Harold Whitmore. He would protect his father not out of love, but out of self-interest. And he would destroy me if he could to preserve his own position. So I let him be blindsided along with everyone else. It was the only safe option. The day Rebecca's article went live was surreal. I watched from my apartment as my phone exploded with notifications, as social media erupted with discussions of the revelations, as news channels started picking up the story and running segments about the charming banker who had allegedly defrauded his colleagues, stolen from his wife, and emotionally abused his family for decades. The reaction was overwhelming. Some people were skeptical, defending Harry's reputation, insisting there must be more to the story. But the evidence was too detailed, too comprehensive, too well documented to dismiss easily. The photographs of documents, the testimony of Graham Bennett, the excerpts from Graham's journals all painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Harry's response was exactly what I expected. He issued a statement through a lawyer calling the accusations baseless and defamatory. He claimed he was the victim of a family vendetta orchestrated by bitter relatives who resented his success. He specifically mentioned my grandmother's mental health struggles, implying that her journals were the ravings of an unstable woman rather than accurate documentation. He hinted that I had been manipulated by outside forces with their own agendas. It was the same playbook he had used his entire life: discredit the victims, rewrite the narrative, present himself as the innocent party being unfairly attacked. But this time, it didn't work. There was too much evidence. There were too many people corroborating the story. Graham Bennett gave interviews describing his experience. Dorothy spoke publicly about her sister's suffering. Other people started coming forward, people who had been cheated or bullied or silenced by Harry over the years, people who had been waiting for someone else to be brave enough to speak first. The wall of silence Harry had built around himself started to crumble, and behind it was a mountain of pain he had caused that could no longer be hidden. The legal consequences followed swiftly. The Fraud Enforcement Division opened an investigation into the banking documents I had provided. The civil suit I filed on behalf of Graham's estate moved forward, with preliminary rulings that were favorable to our position. Harry's assets were frozen pending investigation. His reputation, so carefully cultivated over decades, was destroyed in a matter of weeks. The people who had admired him, the colleagues who had respected him, the friends who had celebrated him, all quietly disappeared, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. He was alone in his beautiful Hampstead house, surrounded by evidence of a life built on lies, watching everything he had worked for turn to dust. Uncle Richard tried to salvage something from the wreckage. He hired his own lawyers, attempted to distance himself from his father, claimed he had been deceived along with everyone else. But investigators found evidence that Richard had been complicit in some of Harry's more recent financial schemes, had known about the hidden accounts and unreported income, had benefited directly from money that was essentially stolen. He faced his own legal troubles, less severe than Harry's, but significant enough to end his career and destroy his standing in the business community. The golden son who had been groomed to continue the Whitmore legacy found himself with nothing to continue, his father's empire exposed as a house of cards that had finally collapsed. My mother's journey was more complicated. She spent months in therapy, working through the trauma of recognizing that her entire childhood had been shaped by an abuser who had used her as a weapon against her own mother. She struggled with guilt, with grief, with the challenge of rebuilding an identity that wasn't defined by her father's approval. But slowly, she started to heal. She started talking about Gran differently, remembering moments of connection she had suppressed, acknowledging the mother she had dismissed for so long. She started building a relationship with Dorothy, the aunt she had been taught to distrust, finding in her a connection to the family she had lost. The civil case was settled out of court about a year after everything became public. Harry, facing the possibility of criminal charges on multiple fronts, agreed to return the full value of Gran's stolen inheritance, plus significant damages to avoid a trial that would expose even more of his secrets. The money was placed in a trust, with my mother and me as beneficiaries, with provisions for Dorothy's care and contributions to charities that supported survivors of domestic abuse. It wasn't enough to undo the damage Harry had caused, but it was something tangible, something that acknowledged Gran's suffering and validated her truth. Harry himself was eventually charged with fraud and financial crimes related to the banking schemes from the 80s and 90s. The case took years to work through the legal system, delayed by his lawyer's attempts to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. But in the end, he was convicted on multiple counts. He was sentenced to prison, though given his age and health, the actual time served would likely be limited. The greater punishment, I think, was the destruction of his reputation. The man who had spent his entire life building an image of success and respectability died in public opinion long before he died in body. Everyone knew what he really was. The mask had finally been torn away, and there was nothing underneath but emptiness and cruelty. I visited Gran's grave on the first anniversary of the conviction. It was a quiet morning, cold and gray, the kind of weather she used to love for painting because of the way it softened the light. I brought flowers from her garden, the garden she had tended for decades as her only source of joy in a house that was really a prison. I sat on the damp grass beside her headstone and talked to her, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say the words anyway. I told her I was sorry. Sorry for not believing her, for dismissing her warnings, for making her feel invisible and unheard. I told her that she was finally vindicated, that everyone knew the truth, that Harry would never hurt anyone again. I told her about my mother starting to heal, about Dorothy finding peace, about the money being used for good causes in her memory. I told her that her journals, her careful documentation, her decades of quiet resistance had ultimately saved us all, had exposed a monster who might otherwise have escaped justice forever. I told her she was the bravest person I had ever known, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her sacrifice. The wind picked up as I finished speaking, rustling the flowers I had placed on her grave, and for just a moment, it felt like a response. Like somewhere, somehow, she was listening. Like after all those years of screaming into a void, someone had finally heard her. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my coat, and walked back to my car. The guilt would never fully go away. I would always carry the weight of the years I spent defending the man who destroyed my grandmother. But I had done what she asked. I had trusted her words after her death, even though I hadn't trusted them during her life. I had finished the work she started, and in some small way, that would have to be enough. My grandmother warned me about him. I didn't listen. But in the end, her warning saved us all. The monster in plain sight was finally unmasked, and the woman who saw him clearly for 56 years was finally believed. That's the only ending to this story that matters. That's the justice she deserved. And that's the truth I will never stop telling for as long as I live, so that no one ever forgets what Margaret Whitmore endured, what she documented, and what she ultimately achieved from beyond the grave.